Marjorie, what did your group discuss in your breakout rooms? Marjorie, Arturo, what was discussed in your breakout room?
So some differences that I've noticed, between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, between both of them, I would see more Martin Luther King as like a more subtle approach to his beliefs and all that, whereas Malcolm, it was a little bit more radical, to where he wanted, like, the way he wanted things done, like in any manner, to get it done. Whereas Martin Luther King, would be like a little bit more peaceful, with examples like the bus riots, or little boycotts. And then Malcolm, who had the little bit more radical ideas of, like, whatever it takes to get what we want. That's how they're gonna do it.
Thank you, Arturo. Kevin, what was discussed in your breakout rooms?
We discussed that MLK or Malcolm had a more aggressive approach to his protesting, as in he sought out force or violence to get the change they desired, his people desired, whereas MLK was more passive and resorted to being humane, as in not acting out so violent, improving the white folks' perspective on black people.
So, in your group, Kevin, you had Ashlyn and Destiny. Um, my question for your group as a whole, because we often get this trope of Malcolm X being one who's violent or advocating for violence. Historically, is there any record of Malcolm X exhibiting or demonstrating any violence? And then not only this question, not only for Kevin, but also for Destiny and Ashlyn. Is there any historical record of Malcolm X being violent?
Not that I know of him specifically, but his followers.
Yeah, even let's say his followers, or let's just say the Nation of Islam, right? Is there any historical record of violence within those groups? Destiny, Ashlyn, do you guys have any ideas of anyone being tied to Malcolm X conducting themselves violently?
Um, well, for me, cause I did for Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, it was a little bit similar for Malcolm X because he had in the way how he would speak to people of his rallies and creating how he will be more non-violent, like showing the people that he could be protecting others and representing the freedom for African Americans. So he wouldn't be violent. That's what I put.
Okay. So, Ashlyn, how about you? Do you have any accounts or records of Malcolm X or anyone tied to Malcolm X exhibiting any violence?
Sorry, what was the last part you said about violence?
Malcolm X, do you have any record of him being violent?
Um, Not really, but I just know that like in a lot of his speeches, like he calls for it if it comes down to it, and he says that like there's a certain point, like there's a certain point that African Americans can take, I think, until like and like now's the time to use violence if people are against it.
I didn't really hear what you said because you're breaking out. But from what I gathered, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying you don't know of him being violent, but you know in his speeches he advocates for violence, or he's not shunning or disavowing violence. That's what I think I heard from you. So if this is the case, No one has any historical record of him being violent. No one has any record of anyone being tied to him being violent. He may not disavow violence, right? Because as we know, he famously says, by any means necessary. But let's be clear, what Malcolm X is advocating for that pertains to any element of violence is what would more accurately be called self-defense. Okay? So now I ask you, because you're not the only people who've done this comparison from the space of violence and nonviolence, right? And I asked the whole class, why is it that every time we do a compare and contrast with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is being the one that's pegged as violent? Why is that? Miguel, why do you think Malcolm X is always the one who's described as the violent one, although he's never done any violence?
Probably because the words he uses in his speeches, like they don't necessarily so like you said, it's more self-defense, but I think he worded it wrong. He didn't exactly say self-defense. I don't know if you understand me.
No, I understand. I understand clearly. But even I'm thinking about particular speeches, right? And the times that he talks about violence is always in response to violence that's been done on black bodies, right? So if that's the case, even though he does not say the words self-defense, he's talking about self-defense, right? So what I'm trying to get you guys to think about is how these narratives around historical figures get told, right? Because I could go in front of anybody and say that Malcolm X is violent, and no one would argue against me, although that's not historically the fact, right? So how is it that we get these narratives? Now I can tell you something else on the flip side. Do you know in the civil rights movement, there was a lot of violence that took place, and the victims were not only black folks. So if I had time, I would read this for you just because I think it's important. So there was a group inside the civil rights movement called the Deacons of Self-Defense. The Deacons of Self-Defense. They have a book about them and there's a movie about them. And what the Deacons of Self-Defense did, particularly when they were in areas like Mississippi and Alabama trying to advocate for civil rights, and the Ku Klux Klan and the sheriff of those towns and other white militant groups would enact real violence on the civil rights protesters, the Deacons of Self-Defense would organize. So for example, one of the historical events, the civil rights movement was organizing what they called freedom schools. So they were teaching black folks how to vote and how to organize around the vote. So when they would have these freedom schools, the Klan, the sheriff, and other white militia groups would come by and shoot up the freedom schools, throw bombs and Molotov cocktails in the freedom schools. So what SNCC, a group, an organization within the civil rights movement did, is they gathered the Deacons of Self-Defense, they placed them on posts around the freedom schools, and anytime that white militia groups would try to run up on the freedom schools, they would engage in shootouts. Okay? Who's heard of this before? Raise your hand if you heard of this before. So no one's heard of this before. So this, by and large, would be tied to the civil rights movement that everyone understands as nonviolent. You follow? So again, stories and narratives. So we have a civil rights group who is largely understood to be nonviolent, right? That actually engage in self-defense act, and I wouldn't even call them violence, they engaged in acts of self-defense, right? We have on the other side, Malcolm X and his group, who've never engaged in any acts of self-defense, but they talk about it and they're being pegged as violent, right? So we need to understand how to separate a story from the historical facts. And looking at the chat, right? It's not your fault, Kevin. It's the school system's fault, right? It's our education system's fault that you're not taught about these things, that you're taught about Malcolm X in a way that causes you to want to step away from him because he's violent and irrational, right? You're taught Martin Luther King in a way that you feel comfortable with that because he's passive, he's non-aggressive, he's non-violent, and he's willing to turn the other cheek, right? These narratives serve a purpose for the powers that be. And this is what I really want you guys to get to understand, right? Martin Luther King is being presented to you in a certain fashion because it fits the narrative of the powers that be. Malcolm X is presented to you in a particular fashion because that narrative fits the powers that be, right? All of these things have a purpose and have a reading. And we as scholars must be critical and be able to unpack the bullshit and really get down to what history tells us. So getting into my notes about the, I have been to the Mountaintop Speech. The speech was given in April 3rd of 1968. This is the last speech that Martin Luther King would give before his assassination. I want to say about a few days later, okay? One of the things that really stood out to me as it pertains to the style of speech that Martin Luther King is giving. When Martin Luther King speaks, he speaks very slowly, very methodically. He uses the pause a lot. So there's a lot of dead space in his speech. Somebody tell me, where is Martin Luther King from? What part of the country is Martin Luther King from? Does anybody know? Nobody?
Is it Alabama?
Close. He's from Atlanta. Yeah, he's from Georgia. He's from Georgia. But you're right in the region, right? He's from the South, okay? So if you know anything about the South, everything happens very slow, right? So if you're being attentive to your audience as an orator, it would not make sense to come down to the South speaking very fast because that would be too fast for them to catch on to what you're saying, right? He's birthed from the South, so he understands that culture very well. So the tempo of his speech is tempered at a level that will fit the audience, okay? But he's talking about unity, and this is something that he shares in common with Malcolm X, right? Unity for all oppressed people. Unity, he says, unity of the enslaved will forever prevent enslavement, right? So once all the people who experience this notion or this idea of enslavement, they are able to come together, they'll be forever to do away with this institution of enslavement, okay? Also, like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King is shifting from a civil rights thinking and civil rights approach to a human rights approach. And he says that he's advocating for the human rights of all people of color, right, throughout the world, advocating for a human rights revolution. So again, this is very similar to the work that Malcolm X is advocating for in the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. He's currently organizing for workers' rights, right? He is giving a speech for the benefit of the sanitation workers in Tennessee. He's also critiquing the United States and making an ethical critique on the United States and calling for them to be about what they claim they're about on paper, right? So you have your Constitution. You tout notions that say America is about liberty and justice for all and the pursuit of happiness. So you must ensure, if you are ethically sound, that you have a situation to where everyone can reap the benefits of this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That everyone is able to take the full benefits of the rights that are offered within the Constitution, right? One of the differences that you'll find within this speech as it pertains to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King is Malcolm X says we need to separate religion and politics, right? So I'm going to create the Organization of Afro-American Unity that will speak to our politics, and I'm going to create Muslim Mosque Incorporated that will speak to our religious needs, right? So for Malcolm, it's a separation, but for Martin Luther King, he says that they should intersect, right? A real preacher should be doing the work of the people, right? So and he names off all the preachers who are up there on the stage with him who are actively engaged in the human rights struggle. And he says this is the type of work that preachers should be doing, right? Um, he's focusing on the problems of the poor. He's advocating for the poor people's movement, right? He uses his biblical references to say that Jesus was working among the poor, right? He wasn't among the rich and wealthy, but he was situated himself among the poor. So this is what preachers and men of the cloth should do, right? Um, and within that, he critiques self-serving preachers, preachers who aren't about the people and who are about themselves, who use their status and their position to maintain further wealth for themselves and allows their congregation to remain poor, right? And he says this is the problem with preachers who are self-serving. They're not doing the work for the people and of the people. Also, something that you find very similar with Malcolm X is they both understand the black power base economically, right? Martin Luther King says at the time in 1968, the black dollar in total is worth $30 billion, right? And he said that there's 9 countries that amass more wealth than black folks totally, right? And he says that we could use this $30 billion as a source of power, right? And the way that Martin Luther King is thinking about it is withholding this amount of money from the power structures. So we'll do economic boycotts against companies like Coca-Cola, etc. Whereas with Malcolm, he's thinking about this $30 billion could be used to build communities and independence for black people. So they both understand the role of the black dollar, but they're looking at the work that it could do from different perspectives. And lastly, there's an urgency in Martin Luther King's speech, right? This was, as I mentioned, his last speech, and you hear the urgency within the message, this idea that, I've been to the mountaintop, their longevity has its rewards, right? I might not make it there with you, right? So he knows his life is coming to an end. And he steps out in courage and does the work that he's supposed to do, regardless of the fate that he would ultimately meet a few days later. So those are my notes for the reading. We'll jump into Fishbowl. Majority of you, I believe, have done your 2 fishbowls already. Is there anyone who has not fishbowled and would like to volunteer before I call at random? All right, I'll call at random. Let me know if you went twice already, and if you have, and then you're good to go. Miguel, have you fishbowled twice? And if not, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
I have done it twice.
Okay, thank you. Destiny, I believe you fishbowled twice. Am I correct?
Was it for last week's fishbowl?
I don't know when you did it, but I want to say you went twice. Do you know or not?
I believe so, correctly.
Yeah, I think so too, Destiny. Kevin, have you fishbowled twice?
I don't think so.
Okay. Are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. So you have one with Kevin. Ashlyn, I believe you fishbowled twice. Am I correct? Or
Yeah, I did already.
okay. Arturo, have you fishbowled twice? Arturo, have you fishbowled twice? Marjorie, I know your mic isn't working. Could you put in the chat if you fishbowl twice? If you have not, you could put your fishbowl statement in the chat. I'll read it out and that will qualify for your fishbowl. Okay, you done too? Cool. So Kevin, I think it's only on you, man. So you could pose a question to the group that would start us off in conversation. You could just talk about something that you found of importance. It's totally up to you on how you want to do it.
Is it fine if I type it in the chat?
I would prefer you say it out loud if your mic is working, man. That's the point, is to engage in
All
conversation.
right. I don't have anything yet. That's fine.
You think about
As in a question?
Yeah, it could be a question, it could be whatever, man. However you want to engage the course is totally up to you.
Or
You can even read from your journal if you have your journal.
if anything, to continue on what you said on why is MLK at a higher standing point than Malcolm, if they practically had the same ideals or similar, it's just each of them had their own way of saying it. So like, why is Malcolm seen as a bad guy per se?
Yeah. And you're posing as a question, Kevin, to the class?
Yeah.
Okay, bet. So, what do you guys think? Why does Malcolm have such a negative connotation to him? Why do you think that is? Miguel, what are your thoughts?
It's like you said, the narrative. Like one is posed as this radical black person, and the other one is like this soft-spoken, very well-mannered person who has the right idea. And another thing is, like I said, is he doesn't exactly say what do you call it? I forgot the word.
Self-defense.
Yes, yeah, self-defense. He doesn't say that. So like I believe they misinterpreted what he said, and also like I said, the narrative, like if it's their narrative.
Yeah. Arturo, why do you think?
What was the question again?
Kevin, can you restate your question, please?
Why does Malcolm X have a negative connotation as opposed to MLK if they have the similar ideals? Just stated differently.
So I feel like Malcolm X used like kind of real world situations, whereas the professor you had discussed about the little militias that had been posted up at those freedom schools, and so he used those examples in his terms of quote self-defense, and then people took his advocation in another way, so it made his people, the ones that looked up to him, might have seen it in a different way. Instead of self-defense, they might have seen it as a more proper way of wanting and to gaining their such rights. Whereas Martin Luther King, it was more of like he would say it and people would understand it with his narrative, and that's how they sparked their little boycotts, the little protests, the little peaceful ways of trying to advocate for their side.
Yeah, Arturo brought up a good point. And what I hear implicitly in Arturo's statement is this idea of respectability politics, right? There's a proper way to go about doing things, right? That's what got Colin Kaepernick in trouble. He didn't do it the proper way, right? Let me ask you, what is more of a threat to a society? The way that Martin Luther King is advocating for change, right? Nonviolently, appealing to the consciousness, the humanity, the good nature of your oppressor or your enemy, or Malcolm X's way of going about it. Any means necessary. There's nothing that's off the table. Do all within your power to get yourself free, right? One would argue that the way that the way that Martin Luther King is going about it is going to allow those in power to stay in power a little bit longer, right? So if that's the case, then it makes sense to why there's a Martin Luther King holiday and not a Malcolm X holiday, right? Because how they present Martin Luther King allows them to stay in power a little bit longer. Now, if they presented I had been to the mountaintop Dr. Martin Luther King, that Martin Luther King probably would not have a holiday, right? They're comfortable with the I Have a Dream Martin Luther King because he's talking about notions of integration, right? This is what his dream is about. But I've been to the mountaintop Martin Luther King is about taking the money from the wealthy and the power and the people in power and reallocating that money to the poor, And that's when you start to get in trouble. And that's why a few days after that speech was given, he met his untimely demise, right? And that's why there's these distinctions between the two. One is a little bit more digestible, one's a little bit more comfortable. The other one is right now, I'm not waiting. Anything's on the table to get my freedom. All right. Is there any last minute comments, questions, or concerns? All right. I'm going to show you guys.